In the vast silence of the northern wilderness, where spruce trees stand like sentinels against an endless white sky, there exists a particular kind of knowledge that cannot be learned from books or passed down through casual conversation. It is the kind of wisdom that seeps into a person's bones through winters survived, through mistakes made and corrected, through the patient observation of how water moves across frozen ground and what happens when the world begins to thaw. This is a story about such knowledge, and about the quiet dignity of a man who understood something that others, in their confidence and their laughter, did not. The cabin stood in a small clearing, its log walls dark with age and weathering, smoke rising steady and true from a stone chimney that had been built with the same careful attention to detail that marked everything about the structure. It was not a large cabin, perhaps 15 feet on each side, with a single window facing south to catch what little winter sunlight penetrated the dense canopy of evergreens. The roof was steeply pitched to shed snow, covered in overlapping sheets of bark that had been treated with pine resin to keep out moisture. Behind the cabin, stacked with mathematical precision, stood a woodpile that represented months of labor, each log split and seasoned, arranged so that air could circulate between the pieces, protected from above by a simple lean-to of poles and more bark sheeting. The man who lived here was called Thomas by those who knew him, though in these remote regions names mattered less than competence, and Thomas was nothing if not competent. He was perhaps 50 years old, though the wilderness ages a man differently than city life does, etching lines of experience rather than stress into the weathered landscape of his face. His hands were scarred and strong, his movements economical and purposeful, and his eyes held that particular quality of attention that comes from years of watching the forest for signs that others might miss. He had trapped these mountains for more than 2 decades, and he knew their moods the way a sailor knows the sea. It was late autumn when the other trappers came through, 3 men working their way north toward their own winter camps, stopping at Thomas's cabin as was the custom in these parts, sharing news and tobacco and the warmth of his fire. They were younger men, confident in their strength and their knowledge, and they had done well the previous season, their pelts bringing good prices at the trading post. They sat around Thomas's table, drinking coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, talking about trap lines and weather signs, and which valleys held the most beaver. It was during this visit that Thomas mentioned his plan to dig a drainage ditch around his cabin before the ground froze solid. He explained it matter-of-factly, as he explained most things without embellishment or pride. The cabin sat in a slight depression, he said, and when the spring melt came, water had a tendency to pool around the foundation. Last year it had reached his woodpile, soaking the bottom rows of logs and making them difficult to burn. He planned to dig a shallow trench, perhaps 2 feet deep and a foot wide, running in a broad arc from the upslope side of the cabin around to the natural drainage that led downhill toward the creek. The 3 younger men exchanged glances. One of them, a broad-shouldered trapper named Cole, set down his coffee cup and leaned back in his chair. "That's a lot of work for a little water," he said, not unkindly but with the casual dismissiveness of someone who has not yet learned that the wilderness keeps accounts and eventually presents its bills. Ground gets soft in spring anyway. Water finds its way. Thomas nodded, conceding the point without argument. "It does," he agreed. "Question is whether it finds its way through your camp or around it." Another of the trappers, a lean man with a reddish beard, laughed outright. "Thomas, you're going to spend a week digging in frozen ground to save yourself from having to move a few wet logs. Man, I'd rather just stack the wood higher to begin with." The third trapper said nothing, but his smile suggested agreement with his companions. They finished their coffee, shared a bit more news, and continued on their way north, and as they disappeared into the forest, Thomas could hear them laughing, their voices carrying clear and bright in the cold air. He stood in his doorway for a moment, watching them go, then turned back to his cabin and the work that needed doing. The forest in late autumn holds a particular kind of anticipation, a sense of the world holding its breath before the long exhale of winter. The deciduous trees had already shed their leaves, standing bare against the evergreens, and the undergrowth had died back to brown stalks and stems. The ground was hard in the mornings, frost-rimed and crunching underfoot, softening only slightly in the brief warmth of midday. Birds moved through the trees in small flocks, feeding urgently before the serious cold arrived, and the squirrels worked frantically to finish their winter caching, their scolding voices sharp in the stillness. Thomas began his ditch on a morning when the sky was the color of old pewter and the air held the metallic taste of approaching snow. He had marked out his line the previous day, using stakes and a length of cord to establish the arc he wanted, starting upslope from the cabin, where the ground began to rise toward the ridge, sweeping around the sides and terminating at the natural gully that already carried water away from his clearing. The total length was perhaps 60 feet, and he had calculated that a trench 2 feet deep and a foot wide would require moving approximately 4 cubic yards of earth and rock. The work was hard. The ground had not yet frozen solid at depth, but the top 6 inches were hard as iron, requiring a pickaxe to break through before he could use his shovel. Thomas worked methodically, breaking up a section of ground with the pick, then shoveling the loose material out and piling it on the downslope side of the ditch. His breath came in clouds of vapor, and despite the cold he soon worked up a sweat, the heat of exertion creating a nimbus of warmth around his body even as his hands grew numb on the tool handles. The forest watched him work with its usual indifference. A raven landed in a nearby tree, croaking its harsh commentary, then flew off when Thomas failed to produce anything interesting. A red squirrel chattered at him from the safety of a spruce branch, annoyed that a human had chosen to make noise in its territory. The wind moved through the treetops with a sound like distant water, and occasionally a branch would crack somewhere in the forest, the sharp report echoing briefly before being absorbed back into the silence. By the end of the first day, Thomas had completed perhaps 15 feet of the ditch, and his shoulders ached in a way that was familiar and almost comforting, the honest pain of physical work done well. He stood in the deepening twilight, looking at what he had accomplished, mentally calculating the days it would take to finish before the ground became unworkable. Then he went inside, built up his fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and bacon, eating slowly while the cabin filled with warmth and the smell of wood smoke and cooking. Day after day he worked, rising with the dawn, heating water for coffee and oatmeal, then stepping out into the cold to continue his excavation. The weather held, though each morning the frost penetrated a little deeper and the work became incrementally harder. Thomas adjusted his technique, learning the contours of his land through the resistance of soil and stone, discovering where clay lay beneath the surface loam and where gravel made the digging easier. He found the rhythm that all solitary workers eventually discover, that meditative state where the body moves and the mind wanders free, ranging over memories and plans and the 1,000 small observations that constitute a life lived close to the land. On the 5th day it began to snow. Light at first, individual flakes drifting down through the still air, then gradually increasing until the forest disappeared behind a curtain of white. Thomas kept working, his coat and hat accumulating a layer of snow that made him look like some patient beast of burden, bent to its task, without complaint or hesitation. The ditch was more than half complete now, a dark scar in the white landscape, and he could begin to see how it would function, how water flowing downhill would be intercepted and channeled away from his cabin and woodpile. The snow continued through the night and into the next day, accumulating to a depth of perhaps 8 inches, before the clouds finally broke and a pale sun emerged. The forest was transformed, every branch and twig outlined in white, the clearing around the cabin pristine except for Thomas's tracks between the cabin and his growing ditch. He worked through this as well, his breath coming harder now as he labored through the added difficulty of moving snow along with earth and stone. It was on the 7th day that he finished. The ditch ran in its planned arc, a clean line cut into the earth, its bottom sloping gradually toward the natural drainage point. Thomas walked its length slowly, checking the grade with his eye, making minor adjustments where snow had obscured his work. Then he gathered his tools, cleaned them carefully, and returned them to their places inside the cabin. He stood for a long moment, looking at what he had created, not with pride exactly, but with the satisfaction of a job completed according to plan. Then he went inside, and the forest settled back into its winter silence. Winter in the northern mountains is not a season, but a siege, a long campaign of cold and darkness that tests everything it touches. The snow that had begun in light flurries became a constant presence, accumulating in layers, each storm adding its increment to the growing depth. By mid-December, The drifts around Thomas's cabin reached past the windowsills, and he had to shovel a path to his woodpile every few days to keep it accessible. The temperature dropped and dropped again, falling to 20 below, then 30. The cold so intense that trees would sometimes crack in the night, the sound like rifle shots echoing through the forest. Thomas settled into the rhythm of winter survival. Each morning he would wake in the darkness, build up the fire from the coals he had banked the night before, prepare his breakfast of oatmeal or bacon or whatever game he had managed to trap or shoot. Then he would check his trapline, a circuit of perhaps 5 miles that took him through creek bottoms and over ridges, through dense stands of spruce and across frozen beaver ponds. The work was cold and often monotonous, but it was necessary, and it kept him connected to the forest and its rhythms. The cabin itself became a small world, warm and secure against the vast cold outside. Thomas had built well, and the walls kept out the wind, while his fire kept the interior comfortable enough that he could work on the tasks that occupied winter evenings, mending equipment, curing pelts, reading the few books he owned by the light of oil lamps, occasionally writing letters that would not be sent until spring, when the trails became passable again. The window offered a view of the forest, the shapes of trees emerging from and disappearing into snow squalls, the occasional passage of deer or the flight of ravens against the grey sky. He thought sometimes about the other trappers and their laughter, but without bitterness or vindication. They were younger, that was all, and youth has its own kind of wisdom that values efficiency and immediate results over the patient preparation for contingencies that might never occur. He had been young once himself, confident in his strength and skeptical of the precautions taken by older men. The forest had taught him differently, had taught him that the difference between comfort and misery, between success and failure, sometimes came down to work done in anticipation of problems that others could not or would not see. The winter passed as winters do, in a succession of storms and clear, cold days, of auroras dancing in the northern sky and the moon rising huge and orange over the frozen forest. Thomas survived and even prospered, his trapline producing good pelts, his supplies holding out, his cabin remaining tight and warm. He rationed his coffee and tobacco, made his meat last, kept his fire going with the wood he had so carefully stacked and protected. The snow accumulated to a depth of 4 feet, then 5, transforming the landscape into something alien and beautiful, a world of whites and greys and the deep green of spruce boughs bent under their burden of snow. It was in late March that the change began, subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. The sun rose earlier and set later, each day a few minutes longer than the last. The quality of light changed, becoming brighter, more intense, carrying a promise of warmth that had been absent for months. The temperature began to fluctuate, still dropping below zero at night, but rising above freezing during the day, and this daily cycle of freeze and thaw marked the beginning of the end of winter's grip. Thomas noticed it first in the sound of water, a dripping from the cabin roof where the sun's warmth melted the accumulated ice, drops falling to create small depressions in the snow below. Then he heard it in the forest, the creak and groan of ice shifting in the creek, the occasional rush of snow sliding from a laden branch. The forest began to wake, cautiously at first, then with increasing energy. Birds appeared that had been absent all winter, their songs tentative but growing stronger each day. The tracks of animals multiplied in the softening snow, and Thomas saw the first signs of bears emerging from their dens, their distinctive prints large and clear in the wet snow. The true melt began in early April, and it came with surprising speed. The temperature rose and stayed risen, climbing into the 40s during the day, and the snow that had accumulated over months began to disappear with astonishing rapidity. Water was everywhere, dripping from trees, running in small rivulets down every slope, soaking into the ground and flowing over it where the earth remained frozen beneath. The forest filled with the constant sound of moving water, a liquid symphony that marked the transition from frozen stillness to flowing abundance. Thomas watched his ditch with interest but without anxiety. As the snow around his cabin began to melt, he could see how the water moved, finding the lowest points, flowing downhill with the relentless logic of gravity. The snow upslope from his cabin melted first, being more exposed to the sun, and the water it released flowed down toward his clearing, gathering volume as it came, carrying with it pine needles and bits of bark and the detritus of winter. On the morning when the melt reached its peak, when water was flowing in sheets across the still frozen ground, Thomas stood outside his cabin and watched the system he had created do its work. The water came down the slope as he had known it would, a broad sheet of flow perhaps 2 inches deep, moving with purpose toward his cabin and woodpile. But when it reached the ditch, it did exactly what he had planned. The flowing water found the trench and followed it, pouring into the channel he had cut, following the arc around his cabin, bypassing his woodpile completely, and flowing out through the drainage he had oriented toward the natural gully. The ditch performed flawlessly. What would have been a spreading pool of water around his cabin, what would have soaked his woodpile and turned the area around his door into a muddy morass, instead flowed neatly and efficiently away, contained and directed by the simple channel he had dug months before. His woodpile remained high and dry, the ground around his cabin stayed firm, and the water found its way to the creek without causing any of the problems that had plagued him in previous years. Thomas watched this for a while, then went about his morning tasks, checking his traps, preparing his breakfast, tending to the 100 small chores that constitute daily life in the wilderness. But there was a quiet satisfaction in his movements, a sense of vindication that he would never voice, but that sat comfortable in his chest nonetheless. The melt continued for more than a week, the snowpack diminishing day by day, the forest floor gradually emerging, brown and matted and littered with the evidence of winter. The creek rose significantly, its banks overflowing, its current strong and muddy with sediment. In the low places, ponds formed where none had existed before, and these attracted waterfowl returning from the south, their calls echoing across the awakening landscape. The forest began to green, buds swelling on the deciduous trees, new growth appearing on the spruce and pine, and the understory plants pushing up through the sodden leaf litter. It was 3 weeks after the main melt, when the forest had dried enough to make travel feasible again, that Thomas had visitors. He heard them coming long before he saw them, the sound of voices and the crunch of footsteps on the trail that led to his cabin. He stepped outside to greet them, and found the same 3 trappers who had stopped the previous fall. Cole and the red-bearded man and their quieter companion, all looking somewhat the worse for wear after a long winter in the mountains. They came into his clearing and stopped, looking around with obvious surprise. Cole spoke first, his voice carrying a note of puzzlement. "Thomas," he said, "how is it your camp looks like you just built it yesterday? We've been fighting mud for the last 10 miles, had to move our woodpiles because they were sitting in standing water, and you look like you're set up for a goddamn magazine photograph." Thomas gestured toward his ditch, now clearly visible running around his cabin, its bottom still slightly damp, but the ground on either side firm and dry. "That trench I told you about," he said simply. Water went around instead of through. The 3 men walked over to examine the ditch, following its arc, noting how it had channeled the meltwater away from the cabin and woodpile. The red-bearded man shook his head slowly, and when he looked back at Thomas, there was no mockery in his expression, only a kind of rueful respect. "Well," he said, "I guess we learned something about preparation, didn't we?" Thomas invited them in for coffee, and they sat around his table as they had the previous fall, but the conversation was different now. They asked questions about the ditch, about how deep it needed to be, about the proper grade to ensure water flow, about how to identify the drainage patterns around a cabin site. Thomas answered their questions patiently, sharing the knowledge he had accumulated over years of observation and experience, and the younger men listened with the attention of students who have just learned that their teacher knew something important after all. Before they left, Cole paused at the door and looked back at Thomas. "I'm sorry we laughed," he said, and the apology was genuine. "We thought you were making work for yourself that didn't need doing." Thomas shrugged, a small smile touching his weathered face. "You thought what made sense based on what you knew," he said. "The forest teaches at its own pace. Main thing is you're paying attention to the lessons." After they left, Thomas stood again in his clearing, looking at the ditch that had proven its worth, at the woodpile that remained dry and ready for use, at the cabin that sat secure and undamaged, despite the massive volume of meltwater that had flowed through his area. The forest around him continued its spring awakening, birds singing in the branches, the creek running full and strong, the air warm and carrying the complex scent of growing things. There is a particular satisfaction that comes from being right about something when others doubted you, but it is a shallow satisfaction compared to the deeper contentment that comes from having applied knowledge correctly, from having anticipated a problem and solved it before it could cause harm. Thomas felt this deeper satisfaction as he returned to his spring tasks, preparing his garden plot, repairing winter damage to his equipment, getting ready for the summer season of work ahead. The forest has its own justice, its own way of rewarding those who understand its patterns and punishing those who ignore them. It is not a moral justice, not concerned with pride or humility, except as these qualities affect a person's ability to survive and thrive in a demanding environment. The forest simply is, and those who learn to read its signs, who take the time to prepare for contingencies that others dismiss, who value patient work over immediate convenience, these are the ones who endure. In the years that followed, the story of Thomas and his ditch became part of the folklore of the region, told in trading posts and around campfires, often with embellishments and additions that Thomas himself would not have recognized. But the core truth remained, that sometimes wisdom looks like foolishness until circumstances prove it otherwise, and that the work done in preparation, even when mocked by others, often makes the difference between success and failure, between comfort and hardship, between learning from the forest and being taught by it in harder ways. Thomas continued to trap his mountains, season after season, his ditch requiring only minor maintenance each year, functioning exactly as he had designed it to function. His woodpile stayed dry, his cabin remained secure, and when spring came with its annual deluge of meltwater, he could go about his work without having to fight the mud and flooding that plagued less prepared camps. He never mentioned the incident with the other trappers unless asked, and when he did discuss it, it was without pride or vindication, just a simple recounting of a problem identified and solved. The forest continued its eternal cycles, winter following summer following winter, the snow accumulating and melting, the water flowing according to the dictates of gravity and geography, and in the midst of these cycles, a man lived his life according to principles that valued preparation over convenience, knowledge over assumption, and the patient observation of how things actually work over confident assertions about how they should work. This is the nature of wilderness wisdom, earned not through dramatic revelations, but through accumulated experience, through attention paid to small details, through the willingness to do work that others might dismiss as unnecessary until circumstances prove its value. It is wisdom that cannot be taught directly, but only learned through engagement with the land itself, through seasons lived and problems solved, through the gradual accumulation of knowledge about how water flows and wood seasons and the forest reveals its patterns to those patient enough to watch. And in the end, the greatest validation came not from the apology of the younger trappers or from the satisfaction of being proven right, but from the simple fact that when spring came and the world turned liquid with melting snow, Thomas could step outside his cabin onto firm ground, could walk to his dry woodpile and select the logs he needed, could go about his life without the complications that inadequate preparation would have caused. The ditch did its work silently and efficiently, asking nothing, providing exactly what it had been designed to provide, and that was enough. If you love stories of wilderness wisdom and survival, if you appreciate the quiet triumph of preparation over assumption, subscribe to this channel for more tales from the frontier, where knowledge earned through experience means the difference between thriving and merely surviving.